Please welcome Microsoft MVP, Johan Persson. Today he will be showcasing premiering content in his session, Updates, Features and Testing, ALM for a New ERP. Please stick around after Johan's session for a live Q&A.
Welcome to my session. This time I would like to start by just thanking the people who voted for my session, and also of course for DynamicsCon that I'm sort of allowed to come back. That's always nice. My name is Johan Persson. I work as a senior technical specialist at a small niche company in Stockholm called Engage Group. We work mostly with F&O and helping customers with implementing F&O and so on. I'm also one of the producers of the podcast Dynamics Update, and since a year back or so, I'm actually a Microsoft BizApps MVP, which I'm very proud of. So let's get started. The whole point of this session is that we are going to discuss a bit about how the application lifecycle looks for Dynamics 365 for finance and operations, or finance and supply chain as it's called nowadays. So first of all, we just have a short mention of the one version, and then we'll look at the quality updates and the release waves. We will look at feature updates, and we will talk a bit about testing, and then I have a couple of final thoughts, tips and tricks and so on, so just to make this transition a bit easier. That's sort of the point. So let's start off with one version. So a couple of years ago, Microsoft implemented one version in finance and operations. And this is actually a very big thing. Because one of the things that they did is all around making the update cycle a bit easier. And the point here is that they have changed from what was used to be called overlaying code, that we had in AX 2012, over to something called extensions. And the whole point of extensions is that we are never overwriting any of Microsoft's code. We are adding code to their code base, but we're adding it in places where they have control over what we're adding. And that's sort of the whole point, because when we're doing the updates, as we're going to come to a bit further on, they don't overwrite our code after we have done it. And there was also a couple of different things that has happened, and one of them is the whole low code, no code experience. So doing customizations doesn't actually have to mean writing X++ code. You can actually do a lot of things outside of X++. You can do it in Power Apps, you can do it in Power BI, you can do it in Microsoft Flow. You can also implement things using the add-ons that Microsoft are releasing. So they are releasing a lot of functionality that is actually not within finance and operations. It's outside, hosted outside, and also not generating performance issues inside of the product, which is a big thing, making the system more of a focused system, making it more core system for finance operations. So that's a really important part. So let's have a look at the updates. So Microsoft is currently releasing 7 updates a year. Two of those are actually major releases, sort of. And I say sort of because they release a feature set at 2 separate times over the year, but it's not sure that those releases will actually end up in the product right away. They might be, but they might also be a bit delayed. And the whole point there is that they are announcing the features, and the features are then released when they're done. So that's sort of the reason. But we also get, as I said, 5 other updates. And that's also an important part. So basically, more or less every single month, you will have to go through an update cycle. And you do have the ability to skip up to 3 updates. The whole idea here that we need to figure out is, should you? If you ask me, I would say that you shouldn't, because the whole reason for being current on the updates is that, first of all, some of the fixes that Microsoft release will not be backported to older versions. So you will get the update for the current version. You might get it for the previous version. You will probably not get it for the versions beneath that. So if you have an issue that you have figured out and Microsoft releases a fix and you are a couple of versions back, then you're actually sort of out of luck, because they will not backport it to your version, which is a bad thing. And the other reason why I think it's important to keep up to date is that there is a saying that the more you do something, the better you get at it. If it's hard, do it more often, because then you train yourself into doing it. So I would actually say try to keep up with Microsoft's release schedule to make sure that you don't end up behind, because I usually liken it to like walking the plank on a pirate ship. Once you get to the end, there is really no way to go. So you lose your options. You don't have any options left once you're there. So I would say try to keep it current and try to update one version at a time, because that also makes the update a little less jarring and a little less troublesome, because Microsoft usually tests the updates from this version to the next. There is a schedule on the Microsoft Learn site where you get all of the release schedules that you can figure out when will it be in preview, when will it be general available, when will it be put into the auto update schedule. You don't want it to end up in the auto update schedule, because the thing there is that Microsoft will add it whether you have tested it or not. And then of course we have the most important date, when will it be out of support. And as you can see here, from its being general available on the 14th of January 2022 until being out of service on the 15th of April 2022, that means that you actually do need to keep up a certain pace. And so what you're thinking is, okay, so how do I test this? How do I figure this out? So we will come to testing a bit later, but the whole thing here is that you need to understand that Microsoft is already testing this. We mentioned the preview program before. The preview program is also known as Ring 2, but prior to Ring 2, there is actually two different rings, which means that they are already tested. First in the internal teams, then in the release validation program, then the PAP and the customer preview, and then they're general available. So they are actually customers running the product in production prior to it being generally available, which means that it has been tested. That's not being said that there is nothing that would go wrong. The thing is that there is always things that slip past testing. You might have an edge case that doesn't get validated in the same amount that all of the others. So you should of course test, but we will get to that at the end. Then we look at the updates again. So if you want to skip a version, which is perfectly fine, but it should be a conscious choice. If you skip a version, then you need to skip every single update window. So you can't say we would like to skip 3 versions. You need to go in for every single window and set it to pause, and then you can continue after that. If you're not doing anything, then you end up in the auto update date that I told you about before. That's when Microsoft installs the update, and they don't care if you have tested it or not. So how is Microsoft testing these updates? So they are testing them internally. They of course have the PAP program. They have the first release program, which is also certain customers testing it early on. There is a version where you can actually send in your test cases and have Microsoft validate them without you interfering. So you send them your code, you send them a copy of your database, you send them your test cases, and they will actually run through the test cases for you, which is also a good thing to do. But you need to plan ahead, and that's the whole point. And we will come to the release cycles later on, but normally what we recommend is to have a sprint schedule. So you actually do maybe monthly sprints, and you actually incorporate the Microsoft updates into your sprint, which is an important part. So outside of the major and minor updates, we also have quality updates, and those are released multiple times every day actually. So these are hot fixes for every single issue that Microsoft finds with the version that you're running right now. So every time you call support and they need to build a fix for your issue, they will release a hotfix. And all of these hotfixes are always cumulative. So you can't cherry pick them. You need to pick one, and then you automatically will get everyone up to that point. So you will get all of the ones up to that point. And as I said, they are releasing quite a lot of those. And this image that you're seeing right here, it's fairly old, but this is actually on a year span of, I think it was a bit over a year, where they actually released almost 5,000 hotfixes. So this is not like one major version, this is multiple major versions. But the whole point here that I would like to get to is that when I talk to customers about this, they tell me that, oh, it's not very good that you have a product that needs almost 5,000 hotfixes over a little over a year. But I would like to turn it around and say that the whole point is that Microsoft has a commitment to this product. Otherwise, they wouldn't release almost 5,000 hotfixes over a year, which is really, really important to understand. If you contact Microsoft with an issue, it's in their interest to fix it. Not like we did on AX 2012, where we could actually fix things ourselves, because if Microsoft fixes it, it will be fixed for everyone, not just for you. So that's why I think it's important. As I mentioned before, some of these hotfixes are actually backported. So if you're on a previous version and you would like to update that one, some of the more severe hotfixes are sometimes backported to the older versions without you having to update to the newest. But with that being said, it's still important to keep the pace of Microsoft. All right, so the next part here is that for every major and minor version, there is actually features. So for every version, you get new features. They are either internal or external. What do I mean by external features? So external features is features that depends on one of the Microsoft microservices, the ones you see in LCS, the add-ins that you see in LCS, like export to data lake and tax calculation service and so on. But there are also internal features, which are most of them. And those are released through the feature management workspace that you can see in this picture. You get a couple of those every time. And the question is, how do we handle the features? I would say that I think that we should try to do the same with features as we do with the update. We should try to keep up to date with the features as well. We should have as short of a backlog as possible when it comes to features, because the more features we have, the more features we need to test and verify, and that adds to our workload a lot. So try to minimize the list that you have left. And one of the ways to do that is actually to group the features into a couple of different scenarios. So there are regional features. Those are the ones you see on the right here for Belgium, Brazil, China, Eastern Europe, and so on. And usually when we had AX 2012, the reasoning was that we don't have an office in Brazil, so we shouldn't install the Brazil updates. I would say that you should think the opposite way. I think that you should think that we don't have an office in Brazil, might as well install the Brazilian fixes, because the Brazilian fixes shouldn't affect us at all, since we don't have an office in Brazil, since we don't have a legal entity in Brazil. They will never be activated at all. So I would say all of the regional ones that where you don't have a legal entity, just install them. The other ones, you should probably install them anyway. Some might need to be tested and verified, but there are also a lot of like low-hanging fruit, things that should just be enabled. There are also, for instance, there are performance features. So this feature adds better performance in this case. That's also important. Those you should probably install right away. You should probably verify them, but I would say do the same thing that you would do with the fixes. At the start of your sprint, enable the features and verify them during the entire sprint. So once you go and release your new code base, your customizations, your Microsoft updates, you should also have a process for enabling the correct features. And of course, as I said, there are features that need to be tested, that needs user education and so on. Those should also be handled. There are a couple of UI features that you also need to take into account. So there is the new grid, for instance, which has caused some issues now and then. But as I said, we should try to stay up to date. There are a couple of different statuses on the updates, as you can see. We have preview updates. Those you should never add in like any test environment or any production environment. And the reason for that is that they're usually not ready. They're usually not in general availability. There are some exceptions. There are some very benign features that actually add a lot of usefulness. So you can actually start by testing them in your test environment. And if they are not okay, then you can turn them off again. There are features that are released. There are features that are on by default, and there are features that are mandatory. It used to be that all of the features were off by default, and they were always off by default until you turn them on. That's not the case anymore. So the timeline here is that when the feature is released, after 6 months, it will be on by default, and eventually, after 12 months, it will be mandatory. So you should have a plan for putting them into production within a year. But I would say that a year is normally fairly good time to verify and validate and test all of the features. And as I said, after 6 months, they are on by default, meaning that once you do an update, it will turn the feature on. So you will have to make sure that you can turn it off every single time you do a release to production, so that you don't end up with features that you don't have control over. I just wanted to show you a snippet from the documentation of this on by default feature that actually says that for instance, if you have a feature that is available in April, it will be set to on by default in October, and then it will be mandatory in April again. So this is just a quote from the release notes regarding the on by default. So we come to testing. We need to start being used to testing things, and we can test things manually. We can test these things automatically. However we do it, we will have a lot of work. I mean, automatic testing is not free. It's not easy. It does require a lot of maintenance. So I would say if you're short-sighted, then automatic testing is almost as expensive as manual testing. The point of automatic testing is that you can run it way more often, and you can actually build them in a way that you make sure that since you run them a lot, then they will be much more stable than the manual test cases. And also the manual test cases is depending on a person. There is no guarantee that it will be executed the same way every single time. So it's really, really important that you continue to do this. So I would say that for every sprint that you do, you need to have a testing cycle, and preferably it's automatic. But as I said, until you get a decent amount of automatic test cases, you probably need to do both. One thing that I advocate a lot is something that I call implicit testing. When I come to customers and talk about the Microsoft updates, and I tell them that Microsoft will release new versions every single month and you need to be current and you need to be testing, and then they say, so how do we test Microsoft's releases? Well, that's the whole point. You don't test the Microsoft releases. You test your business processes. That's the most important part. If you can execute your business processes, then you have tested. And you need to grade your business processes from extremely important to not so important, and then you determine the amount of testing and test cases depending on where on the scale it is. There are some cases where Microsoft do certain new features and certain new code areas where you might focus on those, but I would say for the most time, use end-to-end testing and verify that you can execute the business processes. That's the most important part. So you need to have a testing scope, because you won't be able to test everything every single time, because that will break you eventually. So end-to-end testing and regression testing. So for instance, try to build automatic test cases for bugs that you have discovered, for instance. That's an important part to validate that you don't get the bugs back again. So that's important. So which cases can we automate? So we can do simulations, we can do smoke tests, regression tests, of course, end-to-end scenarios, business critical processes is very important, because we want to run them at every single release to make sure it doesn't break anything. Performance testing is almost mandatory to automate, because you will never get any amount of testing done manually in order to get a real performance test. Migration testing is also a good thing. Security and penetration testing. I mean, validating the security roles, I think, is a really important part, so that especially if you use Microsoft's security roles, it's important to validate that you don't leak any information where it shouldn't belong, and so on. So that's the important part of the automated tests, and I think I actually think that we will get to that at a bit later. But one critical part here is that you need to figure out which tool to use. So I mentioned RSAT before. That's Microsoft's tool for testing. Unfortunately, it can only test finance and supply chain. So it can test finance, retail, supply chain, warehouse, and so on. It can also test the POS application, so the point of sale application, but it can't test sales. It can't test CRM or field service or marketing or commerce. So we need to figure out a way to do this testing. There are workarounds to get RSAT to test some of these integrated components but you actually have to add extra X++ code in order to have RSAT control the entire test scenario, and that might actually defeat the purpose, because then you add code that in itself can actually break things, which is not a good thing. If you want to test integrations, you want to test ISVs, you want to test sales, CRM, and so on, then you need to figure out if there is a different test suite or a different test application for you that makes that you can build your test cases in a good way. We have actually looked at a couple of different ones, and this all depends on how much work you would like to put into your test cases. RSAT is pretty straightforward. You use the task recorder to build your test cases, and once you've built them, you upload them to DevOps, and they will end up in RSAT, so you can run them from a workstation basically. There is a very, very good integration with F&O, meaning that the test application actually understands that it's testing F&O, meaning that it understands business processes and so on. It's fairly usable. I had a dream once that you could actually have end users build the test cases, but I've actually revised that dream because that really doesn't work. And the reason is that there are some very big differences how you build a test case compared to how you build like a regular task recording. You need to be much more thorough and much more detailed when you build a test case in order for it not to generate failures. We've also looked at X Plus Executive Automates and a tool called Rapise. And then, of course, there is the Selenium suite, which is a general test tool for web applications. But that also means that you need to have a better understanding of how to test finance and operations, because Selenium in itself doesn't really understand how finance and operation works. So you need to make sure that you build robust, stable test cases that doesn't fail intermittently because it's done in a certain way. So that's important. And so you need to figure out which test suite matches your application suite, so to speak. What's also important is that you need to have a buy-in from the organization. I mentioned before that it's not free to do tests. It takes time. It takes time to manage them. It takes time to write them. It takes time to maintain them. It doesn't take that much time to run them because that's fairly automatic. But you do need to put in. It is an investment, and because it's an investment, you need to have the steering committee and the business and the project on board, and even the C-suite executives. They need to understand the value in writing automatic test cases, because otherwise they will just think that it's expensive and nothing else. And there are a couple of different levels where you can actually do things and who does things. So I would say it is a bit sketchy if super users are the ones recording the RSAT test cases, but I would say that maybe an application specialist that has an understanding of the differences between a test case and a regular task recording could be good there. But then you also have like component tests and unit tests, and those require developers. But they are still very important, because it actually lets you rewrite code without having to worry about if you break things. Because if you have good component tests and unit tests, you can actually run those after you have rebuilt the code and verify that the result is the same. So that's important here as well. And then you of course need to validate your data as well, the imported data, the master data and so on, and you should actually have test cases for those as well, which is important. So I mentioned before, you need to scope your tests. You need to prioritize, especially when you build automatic tests, you need to prioritize where you put in the effort. I think that you should rate your business processes, and you should figure out, where do I lose money, customers, or reputation? Those are the highest priority. There are business processes that are not as important or as urgent. They are important but not urgent. So for instance, a year-end closing process. If you've just done a year-end closing and you do a change that might affect it, and you actually see that it breaks, then it's actually not that urgent to fix it. You have time to fix it. And regards fixing it, it's also important to understand that we will almost never be able to roll things back. What we will be able to do is assemble a team that can actually fix the issue rather than roll it back. Because the problem is when we roll it back, we change the database schema, and that means that we might end up in a situation where we don't actually know what we have in the database, which is important. So I have a couple of final thoughts here. First of all, I would like to leave you with a question. What is the difference between a project and a product? And the reason why I'm asking this is that this makes quite a lot of difference on how you maintain the system. If you see it as a project, there is an end time. That means that you see a last date on when to support the system. That's actually not going to happen, because you will have to maintain the product forever. And there is a clue there. It's a product. You have built a product, you have installed a product, you need to maintain a product. And you can't really stop maintaining it, because Microsoft will continue to release updates and you will have to continue to install them. So the important part here, how do we do this? The key here is agility. I have talked a lot about sprints, so I think the only way of doing this is actually to have a sprint cycle which is fairly quick. I usually recommend trying to sync it with the business. So I would say, since the business mostly work on month schedules, I think that we should probably try to keep it around a month, because it syncs very well with the business, and it's not that quick that you're used to in other development projects, but since we do require a lot of testing and validating business processes, I would say that the month is fairly okay. We need to maintain the life cycle of the application. We need to do this iteratively, so we need to do this every single month. There might be a month where we don't do anything, but it should still be part of the sprint schedule, so to speak. And then you should, as I said, you should have a process for regression testing to make sure that you don't break things when you do development this frequently. Also, when it comes to features, as I said before, put them into the backlog in DevOps. That's the easiest part. That's where you keep track of them. Assign them to an application specialist so they can actually value the amount of work of putting it in, or the amount of things that it breaks, or the amount of training that it requires. And also try to have the default answer as yes. Should we install this feature? The default answer should be yes. If we see issues, then we might say no, but the default answer should be yes. And as I said before, test it end to end, because end-to-end process testing makes sure that you can continue to work, and that's the most important part. So my final thoughts here. A lot of the testing has actually already been done. Microsoft is doing a lot of testing. First release customers is doing a lot of testing. There are a lot of support issues being sent in. A good way to keep track of those who are already testing the preview is actually to sign up to the Dynamics Insider program and to log into the Yammer forums for the preview forum, because a lot of people, once there is a new release, they will actually report things there, and that's one of the important parts here, that you will understand what is happening. Normally the impact is minimal because of the extension model. Deploying the code shouldn't break things. Microsoft is normally quite good at telling you when they introduce breaking changes, and you normally have a fairly good head start on fixing them actually. So that's also an important part in this. So the impact should be minimal. Microsoft actually has some, they actually have some processes on doing ALM. They have done this for quite a while. They're doing it in Azure, they're doing it for their Office products and so on. And they don't have a reason to break things. They want to make things work, and that's the most important part here. You're already paying for feature improvements and for updates. Make sure that you can actually make use of that investment and that you actually get the most bang for the buck, because, as I said, you're already paying for an evergreen product. You should make use of it. You should actually look at the new features and try to use them as much as possible. Some amount of trust might be required, so you need to trust Microsoft here. You need to trust that things doesn't automatically break, because the reason for this is that it's the only way of scoping your tests. You need to trust that some things might not break. You don't need to test everything. If you're unsure, if you want to validate things, especially features on an early stage, have an extra environment where you have a copy of your database and where you're running the pre-release version. Because then you can actually test the features at an early stage. You can give feedback to Microsoft. You can actually file support cases towards the preview, or at least send them to the Yammer group and make sure that someone from the product team picks up on it and verifies that it's being fixed before it's going into GA. So that's a good thing as well. Hopefully it will be handled before you end up in this. And then, as I said before, implicit testing. You shouldn't need to do that much explicit testing. So if Microsoft release a new feature, please start by thinking that it probably works, and run through your business process tests and validate if you can still do everything that you were used to be able to do. If there is something broken, then you can actually file it as a support issue to Microsoft. But I would actually recommend you, if you have this extra environment that I talked about before, where you have the preview, maybe you have an environment that is only the Microsoft release and nothing that has to do with your code. Verify it there as well, because it might be that your code in some way is incompatible with the new version, and in that case Microsoft will bounce the support issue right back to you, and you will have to figure it out. So doing an extra bit of testing before you send it in and validating that without our customization it's still breaking. That's an important part, because otherwise, as I said, you will get the support issue back again. The whole point here, I would like to get back to the trust part here, and that's important, because if you look at your other Microsoft software, you have Office 365, you have probably Windows, you have Office, you might run iOS and Android for your phones. How much testing do you do there? When Apple releases a new version, do you do testing for that version? When Microsoft releases the Tuesday, second Wednesday patches, do you test those? Probably not as thoroughly, at least. So I said again, please try to give them the benefit of the doubt. I know that things might break, and I've experienced it, but it's actually not that often that it happens. And if you have a good end-to-end verification of your business processes, you will probably find it along the way. Actually, the two different ways I've seen it break is in one case where Microsoft did a change to an entity without actually telling us first. And then in one case, it was actually an implementation partner that had used a business process in a way that it wasn't supposed to be done. And that actually made things break when they started to validate a field that we didn't think was that important, actually. So that was it for today. There will be a Q&A right after this, and I will be there to answer questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to hand them to me in the Q&A, and I'll try to answer them. And otherwise, I would like to say a big thank you for letting me speak again at DynamicsCon and for voting my session up to be able to have it. So thanks a lot. Bye bye.